Chapter 5, Communication and Language. When we think about communication, the first thing we need to understand is that communication is the ability to impart or share some kind of common understanding. We communicate by agreeing, unconsciously or consciously, to call a book, or to call a dog, a movement, a concept by a particular name. It's an agreed upon way to symbolize. Nonverbal communication includes things like facial expressions, body language. All these things communicate. Some nonverbal communication is universal. Facial expressions like being happy or sad, surprised, angry, disgusted, afraid. Many cultures have those same kinds of facial expressions to symbolize the same emotions. But many cultures also vary. You just have to figure out where you are and what means happy and where. Interestingly enough, there's actually a study of this nonverbal communication. It's called kinesics. And that study looks at body movement and signs and gestures. Differences in pronunciation come from accent studies, but kinesics look at things like how people symbolize physically. Interestingly enough, the FBI has looked into studies and actually crafted a whole set of research around watching nonverbal communication to figure out if people are lying, and to also figure out when people are just simply evading the truth. And this is an area of study that can be explored as a graduate student and on into a profession. I think they even had a movie about a person who was an expert at reading body language, and he could tell the police whether or not the suspect was lying simply by listening to them and watching their movements. That's a pretty interesting concept, and it has proven to be rather reliable. We tend to not just speak with our mouths, but speak with our bodies, our eyes, the tone. All of these things influence how we are communicating. Accents, or differences in pronunciation, are another focus that anthropologists have looked at in linguistics. And we looked at how different groups of people speak to figure out either where they're from, or what culture they're participants in, what geographical location they're bound to. Oftentimes in class we'll talk about people who have a Charleston accent. And you can definitely understand them. They're still speaking English, but the accent is heavy enough that in class, when we have individuals in our classes that are from the area, you can hear the differences in how they speak, and that usually will be the way to pinpoint them geographically. Sociolinguists, linguists also do things with paralanguages, and that means that they are looking for features that transmit meaning from other areas other than language. So for example, if the language is no longer being spoken, they oftentimes can look at the languages around the particular language they're trying to investigate to figure out what the current, what the language actually consisted of. Another form of communication that is often very relevant for us is non-human communication. At one point in anthropology, the standard was that if a part of what made us human was our ability to speak and our ability to talk. As research has developed and we see the massive amount of research on primates and how they are able to communicate and use language, that research has been reevaluated, and they've come up with some different things that humans can do that animals can't do, or just may not be doing in front of us, or may not be doing right now. So non-human communication, so the question ends up being, how much communication do they really do? Bees, primates, dolphins are all animals animals that do communicate. And previously we said, oh, language was one of our defining aspects of what made us human. But with research into dolphin pods, whale pods, we've had to change that a little bit, and we realized that symbolic communication has a couple of different aspects that humans do differently. So the referent, or the thing we are referring to, oftentimes it has to not be in the area. So for example, if I'm trying to talk about a book to symbolize, I can't have the book there in the area with me. So the next thing that you add to it is that the meaning has to be arbitrary. It may be called a book today. I may be using, this concept of, okay, this is a book, but in another culture it might be a gnome, a tome, a morph, whatever. It's arbitrary what I call it, as long as everybody agrees that this is what we're calling it. Reminds me of statistics sometimes. And finally, the symbol is what we are using to refer to the referent. So the symbol is book in language. And if I write it down, the word book, then that symbol refers to this particular item. And that's the referent. Monkeys also are able to do this now. They've seen that primates can use this kind of complex symbolic communication. So they started to really look at how do we differ from animals? And what they came up with was that there are some quantitative differences. We have a much larger set of symbols that we use. The next thing is that primates use closed systems for symbolization. So that means that they're not combining different symbols and creating different symbols. They're simply replicating the symbols that have been passed to them or taught to them. And finally, people can talk about past and future events symbolically. And that's one of the things that separates us from humans, from animals, from primates. So those are the symbolic communication concepts that help pull us out of the primate world and into humanity. So that's what makes us human, symbolic communication, and our ability to use it diversely and to create from it, and to have such a large body of symbolic communication forms. This is part 1 of Chapter 5, Communication and Language. Dr. Sybil Sez.